Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Carolyn Ferrell, discussing her debut novel, Dear Miss Metropolitan, in conversation with Joanne Beard. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing virtual event series. As we remain digital for the time being, we're so excited to continue the work of bringing authors and their writing to our community during these difficult times. Especially now, it is through the support of authors and our beloved readers that we are able to make events like this happen. So thank you so much for continuing to show up for us week after week. For tonight's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask the speaker something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all your questions. We'll get through as many as time allows. If you go to the chat section, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your own copy of Dear Miss Metropolitan. If you already have a copy of the book or would like to contribute to this series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you're able to extend to us at this time. Please note that closed captioning is available for this broadcast. Depending on which version of Zoom you are using, you may need to enable it yourself. Simply locate the button marked Live Transcript on your display and click through all the options. And one final note, as you have probably experienced during virtual gatherings this last year, technical issues might come up. If any glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Carolyn Ferrell is the author of the short story collection, Don't Erase Me, which was a recipient of numerous honors, including the Art Seidenbaum Award of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. She has received grants from the Fulbright Association, City University of New York Magnet Program, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Her acclaimed stories have been anthologized in Best American Short Stories 2018 and the Best American Short Stories of the Century, among other places. She teaches writing at Sarah Lawrence College. This evening, she is joined in conversation by fellow Sarah Lawrence professor Joanne Beard, author of the beloved essay collection, The Boys of My Youth, as well as the novel In Zanesville and Festival Days, for which I will also be posting a link to purchase in the chat. Her work has appeared in the New Yorker, Tin House, Best American Essays, and other magazines and anthologies. She has received a Whiting Foundation Award and nonfiction fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation and the New York Foundation for the Arts. This evening, they'll be discussing Carolyn's debut novel, Dear Miss Metropolitan, a harrowing portrait of the unimaginable and its unrelenting aftermath that Roxane Gay calls a monumental provocation and a work that heralds great things to come from an immensely talented writer. Introducing us to Fern, Gwyn, and Jasenia, three young girls with families, ambitions, salvations, as they endure years of captivity and torture in a dilapidated house in Queens. Dear Miss Metropolitan plunges to the heart of the matter and its wake, detailing the daily horror, the ailing wishes, and our culture's horrifying propensity for turning tragedy into spectacle. Unfolding via brilliant fragments composed of jagged bits of narrative, news stories, quizzes and questionnaires, and private incantations and spells, this novel is an urgent and incensed portrayal of trauma and the midden it makes of our lives. We're so excited to be hosting this event tonight. Without further ado, I'm now delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is all yours, Carolyn and Joanne.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, Joanne. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you? It's great to see your face after such a long time.
It's the feeling is mutual. It's so great to see your face, and it's so great to hear your voice. As Ben mentioned in the interview, and for all my viewers, all our viewers, I have Joanne's beautiful book in the background in my little book museum here, her newest book, Festival Days. And I just feel so honored to speak to you, Joanne. I mean, you're a beloved colleague and a beloved friend, and I'm just so happy that we get a chance to talk.
Thank you, Carolyn. Carolyn and I haven't seen each other for a long time because the world shattered, but also because I had an ill-timed or well-timed sabbatical. And so I haven't been on campus for a long time. So even seeing your face is like, oh, you should be standing at the Xerox machine and I should be like digging around in the kitchen looking for something to eat between my classes. But anyway, it's wonderful to see you. And I it was really interesting to me that you know, I read your book earlier and then I read it again this summer with the knowledge that you and I would be talking today. Um, but just a moment ago, when Benjamin said the names of the three girls, Fern, Gwen, and Jasenia, I felt tears come to my eyes just hearing somebody say those names, which is that's a really powerful, strange thing to have happen, actually, for me. I've read several books since I read this for the last time. So I just want to say I found the book to be really moving, really strange. And by strange, I mean, that's a high compliment. Impossibly ambitious. And ambitious in the way that that is like a high wire act, sort of. And I'm always curious about writers who make books like that, that aren't like other people's books, that sort of that break the mold and create something new. That I kept thinking while I was reading this book that it wasn't really a novel. And so also hearing everybody say this is your debut novel, I don't know how to take the idea of the novel and make it fit this work. So, I mean, I don't want that to sound negative because it isn't
No.
negative, but I do think that when you do what you've done, which is create a book that really colors outside the lines, to say something sort of cliched and banal, but it's the only way I can think to say it. When you create a book like that, sometimes when it comes out into the world, you almost have to cringe, wondering how the world is going to accept it, or if the world is actually going to understand how to read that story. And I've been tracking what's happened with you and with this book, and it seems like the world does understand what you're doing, and like you've actually hit a kind of emotional chord that you might not have come anywhere near if you had written this story in a different way. And you're nodding like this thought has occurred to you, or like it's being revealed to you right now. So do you want to comment on that a little bit?
Sure, sure. You know, thanks so much for those observations and for that praise, Joanne. It means so much to me. You know, I've spoken elsewhere a little bit about how the book came into being, and I also want to pick your brain, because when I first started to write this story, well, there are two things. There are two questions. The first question is, what gives us the right to write certain stories? You know, that was one thing that was in my mind. And the second thing was, what is the right form for the material? And I know that in your work, you've also experimented with, for lack of a better term, hybrid forms. You know, your work is sometimes called hybrid. And I think that when I began writing this book, I was thinking in a very linear way. And I was thinking that the audience was going to read for the plot. And the plot had to be liberation. They were kidnapped, held captive, and liberated. And that was the linear narrative. And that's how I indeed began writing it. And I finished it, and it ended at 100 pages. And I was like, okay, now what? You know, it's too short. And with a lot of, I don't know, reflection, and also realizing that there were too many gaps, there were too many things missing, there were too many detours that weren't taken. I had to rethink the form of the book. It was not linear, you know, the kind of broken up fragments of that make up this this novel, and it is, I think, really a novel of stories. I'm a story writer, and I thought of so much of this in terms of stories. And you and I have had that conversation before, in terms of fiction and nonfiction, how what matters the most is the story sense and not the real life sense. So as I was writing this book and also thinking about the characters, now I was influenced by things that happened in real life, but it was really important for me not to think about, not to try to write that true story, that honest, whatever it is, that true real life story, because I didn't feel that I had the right to, and it was not also not my mission to tell the story as it happened, for example, in the Ariel Castro case, or in the case in Austria with that father who imprisoned his, I was really thinking about the freedom that fiction would allow me to have. And I wanted to tell the story of these three girls, but I knew that people would think, oh, Ariel Castro. And that was in some ways my biggest fear. And it's not a fear of mine anymore because it's just happening and I'm just kind of going with it. But I think about that term hybrid a whole lot, and how everything really is a hybrid. Wouldn't you say that's true, Joanne, that everything is a hybrid?
I
Even
do believe.
nonfiction?
Yeah, I do believe that. But I do think that there are books that are more traditionally structured than others. And and this book does not fall into that category. And for me, and I wonder if, because we have to assume that some of the people who are listening in don't know the plot of this book at this point. So I don't know if that means we should sort of encapsulate the actual like story on the surface kind of plot, or if you want to read a piece of it that would give people an idea of what the story is.
That's a great idea. I will actually do both. I'm
Okay.
going to encapsulate a little bit and I'm going to read a little bit. In the broadest terms, this is a story of three girls who are kidnapped and held captive for 10 years in a dilapidated house in Queens. They are liberated after 10 years, and they have to make sense of the world, not only of the world, but of their communities. So they think about, how different the world is, but they also have these nagging questions. Why wasn't anyone looking for me? Why wasn't I important enough to be found, et cetera? And they have to navigate that. And it's, for me, that literary aftermath is what was so compelling and what really drew me to these three girls in the first place. The novel is titled Dear Miss Metropolitan, and she's a character who spends relatively little time in the book. But I envisioned Miss Metropolitan. She's an elderly woman who works for a local newspaper in Queens, which is where the girls have been held captive. And it's also where they are all from. So Miss Metropolitan is an elderly Black woman who's an advice columnist, and her journey in the book is really one of coming to terms with her past and also facing the question, she lives across the street from where the girls were held captive. How did I not know? And then beyond that, what debt do I owe these girls? What is my responsibility? And those are tough questions for her, and they really, kind of do her in. So I just wanted to read a little bit from her section. And the part I'm going to read, it's from a section called Dear Miss Metropolitan. It's going back and forth in time. She's actually in the newspaper office, and she's getting ready to deliver the story. And she's thinking about poetic license. She's not your typical journalist. She thinks about, flourishes, and, she wants to make it poetic and meaningful. But the thing that is always brewing under the surface is, how was I complicit in this crime? How was I, and how am I representative of the community that just did not look for these girls for 10 years? So she's in her newspaper office delivering this. She is having a heart attack, basically. And so there are small parenthetical sections where the editor is calling out for 911, but she is just remembering the night she witnessed the girls being rescued. So without further ado, according to Miss Metropolitan, watching the police lead that vicious rogue away was a sight never to be forgotten in the history of humankind. So that's her headline. What she didn't mention in the article, however, was the way her heart had raced as she watched them handcuff the man formerly known as Ernest, or Ernesto. She didn't mention the way her throat collapsed as the police spotlight shone on the boarded windows of his house where he'd kept the girls. She also failed to note that after the last ambulance pulled away, she believed she might be experiencing another attack of heart arrhythmia, a condition about which she told no one in the office. Every day, Miss Metropolitan felt certain she would collapse in the street and none of her neighbors would notice. Dying alone had always been something of a bad taste in her mouth. None of the above was reported in the article Matilda Maron submitted in person to the Queen's Metropolitan on December 14th, 2007. She'd wanted to stick to the facts, as they taught her in newspaper school back in the day. But just the air alone, in the frenetic nighttime of the victim girls, sparked within her the need to describe, to unmask, to fully comprehend. When she arrived at the newsroom the next morning, the editor took the pages from Miss Metropolitan's hands, typewritten, double-spaced, marked up and down with whiteout and red pen, and thanked her. Last night was indeed a bad night, the editor said. Matilda Maron flopped into an office chair, placed a hand on her chest. Yes, it was a bad night, she said. It saved lives. She drifted, remembering that wool-dark sky laced with the fragrance of snow. She had just closed her bedroom window and positioned herself at her vanity with a ream of stationery and the old blue lamy she used for formal letters. Dear Myrtle, this is her sister she's writing to. Dear Myrtle, I know you are a thief. That Rosenthal did not just walk away on its own. Miss Maddie, the editor said, are you all right? She begins to write more, but suddenly there is a commotion outside. Matilda pushes the letter away, floats to the front door of her small brick ranch, once belonging to Daddy, who'd inherited it at poor Mommy's death. And there it is, sirens shrieking, ambulances sparking the street. She feels a shudder in the sidewalk trees. There are people gathering beyond her yard, stepping onto porch steps. Matilda feels the cold go right through her bed jacket. One of her oldest neighbor friends, Frida Bent, is dangling not 20 feet away at the chain link fence. Frida, in this cold? Wasn't it 10 o'clock? Didn't Frida always sit in front of Law and Order about this time? Matilda wants to ask her friend what's happening, but doesn't. She's a newspaper woman, for heaven's sake, and her job is to find out the answers on her own. The street is pure mayhem, flashing lights and crowds and voices. As she wraps her bed jacket tightly around her chest, it occurs to Matilda that she must be at the scene of a crime. Frida Bent turns toward Matilda and shouts, can you believe this shit? A few feet over, a policeman, puny as the day is short, Matilda notes, swivels on his heel and glares at Frida. How he can hear her above the din is unclear. Matilda cries out, my friend doesn't mean nothing, officer. Pay her no mind. But the puny officer says nothing. His eyes are back across the street. Everyone's eyes are across the street. Matilda crimps down the broken cement steps and toward the chain link fence separating her property from the sidewalk, the street, and the house where all the turmoil is happening. A line of EMTs hover near the front door, talking amongst themselves. Police pace up and down and sideways. Matilda's bed jacket has fallen from her shoulders, but she aches too much to bend down for it. In another time, a gentleman would have offered her his coat as an act of gallantry. Chivalry is dead, she thinks, or at least on a CPAP machine, wheezing out its last dogged breaths. Where are those days, she wonders, huffing towards the puny policeman. She feels old as the hills, but has not forgotten her mission. Good evening, officer. Might you be so kind as to tell me what is going on? Stay back, both of you, the puny cop says brusquely. One of his hands goes to his gun, the other to his radio. Matilda and Frida look at each other. Wouldn't it be nice, Matilda wants to ask, if people just went the extra mile to be kind? Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. It's beautiful. And I just want to say that all those people who are present in that moment, they form almost like a chorus in this book, and they continue to comment and exist in one form or another all the way through the story, past the moment that we see there where the girls are discovered and rescued, on into the future, like 2039 and beyond. So I love that. I'm not quite sure how, I never know how to talk about fiction. I don't know the language you people use, but we're so tight inside everybody's head that in each section you have like this little binocular view. But what happens is that it does become like a chorus, all these different points of view and all these different little binocular, visions of what's happening with those girls in the moment. And then when you get the stories of the girls, it's the same way, super tight inside their head. And it's really, the book has to teach you how to read it as you go along. So each time I would sit down, I would think, wait a second, what's going on? Wait. And then I would go, no, it's just like a current. You just let the current bear you along. And it reminded me of, there's that movie called Wings of Desire.
Oh, yes. Uh-huh.
You know that movie?
I
Well,
know
there's
it
a
well.
moment when the angels are in the library and they're sitting up on the rafters and they're listening. I think this is the right moment. They're listening to these fragments of thoughts that are happening everywhere. And the thoughts are not related to each other. But after a few minutes, you realize that that everybody is speaking on the same wavelength or something, and everybody's trying to get at the same deep emotional core, and you just hear these voices pinging back and forth, but they're thoughts. And ultimately that's what this book feels like, and it becomes cumulative until, as a reader, when you're a third of the way through the book, you feel like absolutely not just the girls, but the neighborhood, the people who are seeing the house but not seeing what's hidden inside, the families who let go of them without meaning to, who would be easy to blame, except that if they didn't get snatched, there would be nothing to blame anybody for.
Right.
So I kept thinking, how in the world did you tap into that river of consciousness that was not one person, but was the consciousness of the entire community? How do you do that? And does it happen by accident?
I would say more trial and error than accident. When I was thinking about this story, or the book as a linear narrative, that was not getting the expansiveness of the girls' stories, and that was also not allowing me to really get into their minds. And Joanne, I mean, thinking about your writing as a nonfiction writer, the portraits that you have in this book, in Festival Days, the portraits that you have in Boys of My Youth, I feel like we had to do the same thing. We had to see the world through these characters' eyes, and we, the question, I'd love to come back to that question of, what gives us the right to write whatever we want to write, but in order to make the story resonate, we have to give up on real life and really embody the characters. I mean, see the characters, see the world, have their vision. And that's a really hard thing to do. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned Wings of Desire. I've seen Wings of Desire 100 million times. I actually read the script of that. I'm so obsessed with that movie. And I know all of those moments that at first they seem like chatter, these angels in Wings of Desire. They just hear everyone's thoughts. And at first it's kind of this mishmash, but the camera and the microphone sort of light on individual characters, and you get a certain depth of these particular stories. I'm thinking about the man who's crashed his motorcycle and is dying and is thinking about his life. And he's reciting details from his life that wouldn't really make sense normally, but Wim Wenders, the filmmaker, is asking us to make sense of it. And in a way, I think that's what I was doing with these stories, is that I was telling it the way I thought these girls would tell it and would see it. And not only the girls, but the community members, the parents as well, the teachers. I felt that all of these voices were necessary, but that what I was hoping would happen was that readers would be able to light then on particular characters and get an in-depth view of that moment, if that makes sense. It is a Greek chorus, there are a lot of voices, there are a lot of forms, but there were moments that I just wanted the reader to just kind of settle in. And I would arguably say it's with the three girls, but it's also with, Miss Metropolitan, and it's with the Mr. P, Gwenny's stepfather, that they exist in the background, but they also exist in the foreground. That makes sense.
Absolutely. And I left this book feeling like I knew all of those people, like I could see them very clearly. Although I will say, one of the most brilliant moves in this book is that the man who is behind the crime remains a shadowy figure. And even to some extent, his criminal behavior toward the girls remains shadowy. And the effect that it had was really profound, which is like when you're seeing a horror movie and you never really get to see the monster. You might see its slimy serpent tail for a moment, but you never see the creature itself. And so therefore you're always on edge. I'm thinking of that book by Shirley Jackson, The Haunting of Hill House,
right,
where the most you ever get is pounding on a door, and yet it's completely terrifying. And so it was really deft and restrained, the way you presented what happened to them and who he was as a human being. And I wondered at the time, was this a conscious decision to simply go, I'm not allowing that into my story, or to say, I know that it'll actually be more universal if we don't actually get to see who he is?
That's such a great question. And I really wrestled with it. I think that there were times in other drafts where I had more explicit violence, and I started to take it out. And even, when I had finished the book, I talked to my agent and she said, well, this one section, take it out, it's not necessary. And she was absolutely right. I don't want to overwhelm the reader. I don't want the reader to look at this book and think, oh my God, I can't stomach it. It's too much for me. I can't deal with it, and as you mentioned, sometimes the suggestion of horror is more horrifying than actually seeing the horror. And that suspense, that sense of dramatic tension is what I think we're all aiming for, right? We all want that that sense of being at the edge. I think that if you go too far, Robin Hemley has this great phrase, never kill your mice. If you go too far, you've killed your mice. It's too much, then the reader is just going to say, too much, and in thinking about, again, thinking about true crime and the things that this book resonated with in the real world, I felt like, when you open up newspapers, or when you read true crime books, you do get all of those details, and it is overwhelming, but the great thing about newspapers is that you shut it, or the article is really short. I thought about, how can I sustain a reader over a long period of time and just constantly, beat them up? And that's not what I wanted to do. I didn't want to beat them up. I really wanted to keep dramatic tension at the forefront more than resolution or giving the answers, what actually happened, right?
Well, I think that you found exactly the right amount to tell and the right way to do it that keeps it from overwhelming the reader, but also doesn't allow it to become reductive. Like the physical violence was not the only violence done. And so there's a, and not to give away anything, but there's this beautiful moment years after the girls are rescued where one of them is invited to sit down on a wooden bench or something. And just for a moment, it flickers through her mind that she had to forgive wood. And then your mind just goes, oh my God, what could it have been? But we don't know. It's a true collaboration actually between the reader and the the reader's imagination and what the writer is leading us toward. So it's really beautiful, really beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really my goal, was for it really, I guess, for it, I mean, it always should be a conversation between writer and reader. But I think when you have such difficult subject matter, you don't want it to tip over into the sensational, you don't want it to, unless you're writing that kind of book. But this was not that kind of book. I did not want it to be a sensationalized story. I don't think I could even write that, because I think that kind of book relies so much on the plot that it's totally plot driven. You're only reading towards the plot, and one of the things, just to go back to Boss Man for a second, that was really important to me. I mean, Boss Man, as I said before, is 99.99% bad, but I could not make him 100%. It's not that I couldn't make him 100% bad. I had to give him some dimension, because otherwise he would not be interesting. As a purely evil character, it's just not interesting, at least not to me. The characters have to have dimension. And so giving a little bit of his backstory, as messed up as he is, I hope that readers could sympathize with him, and not in the way of liking him, but just sympathize, as crazy as that sounds.
Well, and it's so necessary, and you achieve that. It's necessary to make him three-dimensional. And if any of my students are out there, they know that what I really believe is that in order to make something three-dimensional, you have to have light in order to create the shadows. So there was a moment, and I won't give it away, but there was a moment just in passing where he just makes one little comment about what he's been up to. And I thought, oh, I get it. I get that this is not pure cruelty, that there's something in him that's looking for something, and he can never find it.
Right.
And so then, the most cruel thing is that you have to have empathy for even the biggest monsters. I mean, that's what the great literature does, right? So, yeah, it was really beautiful, all of it.
Thank you.
So I want to touch on just for a minute the fact that this book has this is in no way your story. This is a story that you found in your own imagination and through things that you read about, specific crimes, and you created something that lives apart from you. And yet there's something profound about you in there in the form of the photographs.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk about what those are and how those came to be part of the story?
Sure, sure. I've always had a dream of writing something with photographs. And I had written a story years ago, and I had written an essay also. In both cases, I used photographs, and I was told by the editors, forget it, too expensive. So it's always kind of been on my radar. And when I started this book, I was not thinking about adding images to it, but um, as I began to break up into different sections, and I think one of the first images was that image of Dear Miss Metropolitan, of the three older women standing there in front of one of those, kind of cardboard cutouts that were popular. I really, when I used that, because I just thought, why not? I realized that these images would expand the story in an interesting way, that it wasn't just decoration, that the images were also telling a story. And in the same way that newspaper articles were telling a story, lists, everything tells a story in its own kind of weird way. And I just felt that, there are a lot of photographs of place, Queens, Central Park, that do resonate that do appear in the book. But what I was also thinking about, and thinking, about people who use photographs, and one example I'll give is W.G. Sebo in Austerlitz. He uses photographs, and what I thought was so interesting in that novel was that he would have a photograph that had no bearing anything until you read 30 pages later, you're like, oh, that's what that meant 30 pages ago. And I just love that that was another way to create resonance with details. And that's what I was thinking also. I did not want that one-on-one where you'd say, oh, okay, this is Miss Metropolitan. I mean, actually, the picture of Miss Metropolitan does appear on Miss Metropolitan's story page, but I did want to, I wanted them to be more evocative than anything else. One thing that I tell my students that I have them think about is how can you make your details resonate? You don't want them to just sit there. You want to put them to work. So how do you make things resonate? And one of the choices that I was lucky enough to have in this book was to use photographs and images to make stories resonate and go on further and make connections, hopefully make connections, readers would make connections in their own way, because of course, readers bring their own baggage to to the images. I don't sit there and say, well, this is supposed to mean this. They bring their own interpretations. So that was, to me, the most fun of the book was thinking about that, how I can play around with these images and just try to create a kind of resonance. Or what Charles Baxter, I think he calls it rhyming action. When he came to Sarah Lawrence and gave a Zoom chat, he used that term, and I thought that's exactly, that's exactly it. Rhyming is rhyming throughout the whole piece.
Right, right. Carolyn, there are a couple questions here. Can I ask you?
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
So I'm not really vetting them ahead of time, so it's possible that you've sort of answered some of these. Your book grapples with not only the horrifying details of the captivity, but also the grotesque aftermath, specifically the ways that victims of kidnapping are turned into media sensations. Were there stories or images that you really sat with when thinking about this phenomenon?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't actually know. I think that's still in my subconscious. I'm not really sure that I know. I mean, I think that, someone asked me, oh, is TV's Dr. Ezra based on Dr. Phil? And I do know that Dr. Phil actually did talk to one of the liberated women, she'd become a liberated woman, Michelle Knight, after after she had been liberated and taken care of. He did speak to her, and I remember watching that interview. I just turned it on by accident, And there was something that was at once really caring, but also so exploitative about that, and I just thought, oh my God, I just couldn't really put my finger on it, he's saying the right things, but everything is kind of captured in these little sound bites, and then you have to prepare for the commercial to come on, and you have to wrap things up in an hour. And I thought about that. I have been trying to write a story about reality TV show hosts for the longest time, and I never really complete them because they just wind up to be such farces that I can't get any of these stories finished. But I felt that this character, TV's Dr. Ezra, really fit here as somebody who may actually have good intentions, but just can't help that exploitation that, if he had examined himself and his motives a little better, he might have taken a different path, So I did think about not only TV, but about, newspapers, all media, and how it's even Miss Metropolitan, her interpretation of events is slanted by her own biases. And, she's thinking about not only what happened and how to say it in a poetic way, but she's thinking about her culpability. So it's really, really complicated. And that's what I was thinking of, that, these media outlets and people, they can only get but so much of the story. And I think that goes without saying, but it really is actually probably so much smaller than we can imagine. I think when people watch Dr. Phil, they think, oh, wow, I really understand this topic of schizophrenia or homelessness, or et cetera. But it's just, a grain of sand. There's so much to understand that just can't be unpacked in sound bites, right?
Right, and it has to be somehow shaped as an entertainment. Otherwise,
Right.
it won't be on there.
Right.
There won't be anybody to tune in.
Exactly.
So,
and
yeah.
entertainment. How can this be entertainment? How can it be entertainment to be saved, and yet
Right.
it is, right?
Yeah, so here's another question. This is really good. What was your thinking in putting some scenes in the future?
Oh, again, I was, in thinking about the captivity narrative, again, I had to move into the future, and I don't want to give too many spoilers, but there's a character whose story takes place mostly in the future. And I had to make that story resonate with everything that had come before it. I had to make that story in 2039 because it was about captivity, and it was about abandonment, and it was about writing. I feel like the writing piece of the novel was so important to me, and telling the story, and even including Dan Shawn, writing teacher. I felt like he had to be in there.
I love that. And I think Grace Bailey might have made her way through there too.
Yes, Grace Bailey, exactly. So
good.
I had to put all of these things in there, and that meant moving into the future, and again, I guess one thing I'll say is that the idea, and this kind of goes back to the media sensation piece, is the idea that everything can be cured, that there is this thing called closure that can happen after an hour, or it can happen after a TV show. And of course, closure goes on for the rest of your life. Closure doesn't ever end. Closure happens every single day. And that was something that I was really trying to get at by going into the future, was that closure is just an ongoing process. What is closure? Nobody can really answer that, right? Is there an answer? There's no such thing as closure. It's navigating, it's, doing the work, it's all of this other stuff. But that thing that is always said on these talk shows, getting closure, just doesn't exist, right?
Well, I thought that the decision to zoom us forward into the future was really a kindness to the reader, because, and a very unusual thing to do, because really the view that we get of the girls when they're rescued is really through Miss Metropolitan's eyes. And they are, they're in extremity in that moment. And so zooming into the future gives us an opportunity to sort of see the full kind of the trajectory of what their lives turn out to be. And anyway, I felt very grateful for that and very fascinated by it, and actually fascinated by the whole structure of the book. Like I just kept thinking, did she plan this out, or did she just get in it and start driving and see where she ended up? It doesn't matter, because you are so good at what you do that I felt very much like I was just in the hands of somebody who was taking me on a pretty wild ride.
Wow.
But of course, as a writer, you know, you're wildly curious how people go about doing these things.
Right. Well, I would say that I have to say that I just jumped in. You know, I jumped to write what became Miss Metropolitan. And it's hard for me to even think about what was draft one and what was draft 115, you know. In all of those drafts, I just kept, in all of the drafts until I got to the end, you know, and I consider those all rough drafts.
Right.
I was just writing. It's through, as you know, it's through revision that you start thinking, okay, these pieces have to go, they have to work this way. I have to reorganize things. Like, one of the scenes late in the book is a memory that Fern has of Jasenia and Gwen fighting over a bra that Jasenia had brought into the house. And it's Jasenia's one of her last memories of life before captivity, but Gwenny is using it as an eye mask to go to sleep. And they're fighting over it. So that scene was actually one of the first scenes, if not the first scene, that I started the whole book with. And I realized that it just worked better, that it resonated with other things if I put it in later, but that I had to have the whole thing done first. And then I started to think. So I'm one of those people that writes first and then does an outline later, or I don't even do an outline. What I do is I have thousands of notebooks and I just take notes with every scene. Come back to this, come back to that, come back to this. And then of course, eventually I forget half the things that I write. I look it over and I forget it, but some things stick. And, it's in revision that you start doing that more technical, okay,
Right.
this has to go here. But in the early drafts, and by early, I mean like the first 5 years writing this book, you just can't, I couldn't think in that way. It wasn't helpful.
Yeah, and that scene that you're talking about is so incredibly moving, because you also describe what the bra looks like. And it's formerly beautiful, but like everything else, it's completely gray and tattered. And of course, a bra is not needed there, but an eye mask really, really is. Especially, anyway. Okay, I'll ask you another question. This book contains so many different forms, questionnaires, flashes of news reports, spells, and incantations that are so revealing of the girls and their before. Where did this urge to record details like this come from?
That's a great question. I would say that when this really has to do with point of view and thinking about seeing the world through these characters' eyes. And if I were to take, for example, the Devil's Handbook for Girls, which is made up of all these spells, and these older women who find the book, they're sort of at their wits' end. They want to help their friend and they're desperate. So they're going to use this, novelty book with spells in it, even though the spells are kind of written for, high school girls. They're just desperate, And one of the things I was thinking about with each form was what it's going to reveal about the story. What is each form going to reveal about the story? And with those spells, one of the things I was thinking about was how these women, they were in denial. They didn't really want to think about their culpability, not only to the girls, but to Maddie Marum. They did not want to think about, okay, we had just kind of written her off as this kind of crazy old bird. They had a responsibility to her. And this book, even though it's a gag, even though it's made up of all of these spells about high school and cheerleaders and everything, it touches something inside of them. That's sort of what I was going for, was that it reveals something about what they learn about themselves, or what they don't want to see about themselves, so with every section, Clifford T-Town and his memoir, and talking about the New York Times as a journalist, I wanted to show what was important to him and how that was sort of filtered through this experience of finding Jasenia and trying to solve the mystery that's at the center of the book. So each form, even the smallest piece, was a way of revealing something, and it was like a clue, really.
Right. I love the whole section with the incantations that were for high school girls. Basically, it's like the question is, why is there math? Why does there have to be math tests?
Right.
It was really, so the book is threaded throughout with all of these really sharp observations that are also at times witty, so anyway, I think we have time for one more question, Carolyn.
Great.
Let's see. I'm going to say, this is not a spoiler. This is what our questioner says. Only 2 of the girls are rescued, which haunts the 2 survivors. Could you talk about what it was like orchestrating as the writer that vanishing? It recalls so much of what is at stake in these stories, the women who aren't recovered, which I agree with our questioner there, that there are all these women out there who have disappeared. And when you read a story like this, you think maybe they haven't died. Maybe they're somewhere chained to a pipe somewhere. It's a horrifying thought, but it's real, right?
Right. Well, it's also, I would say, what really drove me was the women who disappeared, but people who are disappeared who are actually in front of you, people who are not seen and not heard. And that was, I think, really my entree into the book, that these girls were, even before they were kidnapped, they were not really taken seriously. They weren't seen, they weren't heard. And when they're kidnapped, of course, that makes matters worse because they're physically not there. And when they're recovered, there's also something about them that is a little gauzy. Are they really there? Are they really there? Well, the TV doctor wants to make them into this, who are they? So I was really interested in those people who were just not seen or heard, who actually live. In terms of the vanishing, that I would say was, that plot point was the one of the most difficult parts of the book technically, was to think about, I had been thinking about these portraits that I was drawing of the characters and seeing the world through their eyes. And this little nagging thing called plot just kept, kind of wiggling in my brain like a headache. And I was thinking about a way to connect all of these things. And Dear Miss Metropolitan, I dare say, is not a plot-driven book, but there is a plot there. And the plot was a way for, the plot that I think I created was a way to not only highlight this idea of being there, but not being there, not being taken seriously, right, but also it was a way to incorporate all the times of the book, all of the past, present, and future through this plot. It wasn't what I didn't go in thinking, and that was definitely something that happened in revision. I did not go in thinking, okay, this plot is, the plot actually, it did function as an organizing principle, but with each draft, each later draft, it became much more honed, and I saw what had to go in and what had to be taken out. So, yeah, I hope I answered that question.
Well, Carolyn, you did an amazing thing with this book.
Oh,
I mean, not only did you create a wonderful reading experience, but I think it illuminated some things about girls and women and people being seen and not seen. And uh, I found it unbelievably moving and beautiful and strange, as I said at the beginning, but strange in the best possible way. I don't have time anymore at this point in my life to read really traditional work that doesn't, really illuminate something for me. So this book felt really like a wonderful addition to my summer. So thank you.
thank you so much. I love you, Joanne. That's so great. And if I could just say one more comment, I have to say that I've read these essays and I'm processing them. I'm going to read them again. They've meant so much to me. But a book that has definitely taught me how to write and how to read is your first book, Boys of My Youth. And the way you have these lives that mean that that are there and not there, So I'd have to say that your book was a role model, and it taught me also how to write in I think, a very meaningful way to me.
Thank you. And my great editor of that book is running Henry Holt now.
Oh, fantastic.
So we have that little connection too.
Yay.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Ending with a connection. Thank you once again, Carolyn and Joanne, for this fantastic conversation on craft and this wonderful book. This is such a great way to spend an evening. Thanks to all of you out there for spending part of your evening with us. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase Dear Miss Metropolitan and Festival Days at harvard.com. I've put the links to purchase both in the chat. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy the rest of your week. Keep reading and stay safe, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. Bye, Joanne.
Bye, Carolyn.